Hi, everyone. I hope you had a chance to enjoy the nice weather this weekend. Today we're going to be looking at patent medicines in more detail. We saw the example of patent medicines last week in the lecture. So today we're going to follow up on a few things. One is that we're going to be looking at historical material, but we're also going to be linking it to the contemporary issues around health that also impact or relate to patent medicines today. Okay, so we want to start with a case study. And this case study involves Lydia Pinkham, one of the more prominent patent medicine companies at this time, the late 1800s and early 1900s in the US and Canada. Now, Lydia Pinkham was an actual person. She was born in 1819 in Massachusetts. She got married in the 1840s. She has 4 kids. Pretty ordinary life in some respects. One of the things that she did in her family, which was also pretty common, was she had a kind of home remedy that she made from ingredients. And this was sort of passed down to her from her mother and grandmother. And this was a home remedy that had the ingredients that I've listed here: fenugreek seed, unicorn root, preserved in alcohol. And this was used to help treat symptoms associated with menstrual pain and to a certain degree menopausal issues as well. So Pinkham decides in 1875 to start selling this home remedy. And she and her husband start a company called the Lydia Pinkham Company. And they start selling this home remedy, calling it a vegetable compound. And later they would even sell something called kidney pills. And they proved quite successful by the late 1800s in doing so. And one of the things that sort of created or promoted that success was the fact that they advertised so extensively. And this company's advertising to sales ratios were between 40 and 60% of their revenue. So again, I made this point last week. If they got $100,000 in revenues, they put back 40 to 60,000 of that straight back into advertising. Again, a very high figure. So it's important in some respects to understand advertising. We want to understand those types of companies and those product sectors that used advertising extensively. Now, the company actually did quite well into the early 1900s. And in fact, their sales peak in 1925, which is about 20 years after the sort of the height of the patent medicine industry. So Lydia Pinkham was clearly doing something right in terms of being able to be successful for so many decades into the 20th century. Now, the product, as I mentioned, was primarily marketed to women, and it was primarily marketed around the health issue of what were then called female complaints. And that had primarily to do with health-related issues around menstrual pain, around menopause, and to a certain degree, some kind of post-birth issues that women encountered at this time. Now, these were topics that women generally did not speak about with, they might have spoken about it with, say, close family members, their sisters or mother or something. But generally speaking, polite society did not want people to talk about these issues. And it meant that there was a certain measure of secrecy or even stigma attached to having one of these conditions, right? If you had sort of extreme menstrual pain, you were less likely to want to talk about that, in some cases, even with a doctor, if you had access to a doctor. And so what that means is it kind of created an opportunity for Pinkham both to sell a product that would promise relief for these kinds of conditions, but also the way in which she would do that. And we're going to come back to that later. But note in this ad here, this is a picture of Lydia Pinkham, and she's reading letters. And these are letters that are coming from people writing her, asking about their own condition and wondering whether Lydia Pinkham's product would in fact offer some kind of solution for that. And over the years, Lydia Pinkham's, the company, would actually do this extensively, securing thousands and thousands of letters from people. And in fact, that became a kind of market research basis of the company, and we'll come back to that later. Okay. So why was the company so successful? We mentioned the advertising. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But it was also successful because of the prevailing social norms of the time. And one of those was the belief, and this is encapsulated in the term the age of the womb, was the belief that women's health was primarily linked to their procreative function, right? So that would be the ovaries, the uterus, the womb, and in the sense that if there was something wrong with a woman's procreative function, and that could be manifested in things like unusual menstrual pain, and even to a certain degree, even later with menopause. If there was something wrong with a woman's menstrual, with their procreative function, then that potentially would impact other areas of their health. And that problems, say with the uterus, might mean that you would get problems with your stomach or your legs or whatever the case may be. So this is a very much a biodeterminist view of women. It's obviously not something we hold today. And it's a belief that the primary kind of function of women is seen in terms of their procreative function. And it's also a belief that procreative health bears on the broader health of women in general. Okay, again, this is not really firmed up with a scientific understanding of women and health at this time. It had more to do with kind of prevailing, almost prejudicial notions about what the role of women were in society in the late 1800s. Another factor also involves the weak allopathic medicine opportunities. So those, you may recall last week we talked about allopathic medicine, and that more or less conforms to what our current medical system is today. Being a medical doctor or being a specialist, you go to med school, you get training, etc., etc. There was a fairly limited availability of that in the late 1800s, depending on where you lived, and so it wasn't always an option to go see a doctor if you were experiencing things like extreme menstrual pain. And then lastly, there was a very strong home doctoring tradition, and we talked about that last week as well, that people were very used to trying to deal with their own health problems. In some cases, that were things like home remedies and various other types of things that people would do to try and deal with their own health issues. Okay, so that's a bit of the social context, helping to explain the success of Pinkham. Now, one of the fascinating things about Pinkham, and again, it explains the success of the company into the early 1900s, is that after the first couple decades, say after you get into the beyond the 1890s, the company started to change the messaging of the product to move away from claims about bodily health, i.e. menstrual pain, in more specific kind of bodily or somatic terms, and to broaden the kinds of claims that the product was making to include things like psychological well-being and psychological health. And so you start to see ads starting in the early 1900s that are talking about things like helping women deal with their nerves, avoiding nervous breakdowns, things like that. And in fact, it's part of a kind of understanding that physical health bears on one's psychic health or one's psychological well-being, and that they're really two sides of the same coin, and in that sense. So more and more you start to see ads for Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound in the early 1900s, and certainly by the 1920s, that are really sort of presenting this as a kind of an energy boost, or a kind of a way, or almost a tonic for women to rejuvenate them, to sort of get their minds working properly, and in that sense. Okay? So part of the reason for this as well was that in the early 1900s, the United States government and the Canadian government passed laws restricting the types of claims that patent medicines can make about the health benefits of them. And so, and you see this with other product sectors as well, when there are restrictions on how you can make a claim in terms of specific health benefits or bodily health benefits, you then look for other ways that you can promote a product that don't necessarily fall into that category. And so saying that the product is good to help you maintain your well-being, your mental well-being, or to sort of stop you from feeling down, or preventing you from being nervy or something like that, it's less you're less able to prove that the product is actually not doing that when it's these sort of more general psychological kind of claims, as opposed to a specific claim, say it'll cure you of cancer or something like that. Okay, so here's a couple of examples of these types of ads. This is from a bit later in the 30s and 40s, and you can see here it's targeting women in terms of the issue of so-called, as you see in the one ad here, periodic female weakness. Related to sort of the period of menstruation. But it does it not so much in promising a kind of physical pain relief or help in that sense. It's touting the message in terms of the way you become when you're feeling that way, right? So you become cranky or nervous and somebody who's psychologically sort of unbalanced or something like that. And so the product is going to be pitching its message more and more in this way. And again, that's a smart strategy, especially if you want to ensure that you're not making claims, health claims that can be targeted by regulation or by federal health authorities. Then we see a further broadening of the claims. And it starts to move into areas around general things around weight loss. So by the 1920s, the ideal of physical stature for women is one of a thinner body. And so you start to see Lydia Pinkham and their advertising and the pamphlets they were producing saying the product actually helps you lose weight. It's the same product throughout all these decades. It hasn't changed, okay, in terms of the ingredients, but the types of claims it's making become more expansive. So here you see one example of this, how Phyllis grew thin, and it's, if you were to see this brochure, this pamphlet, it would just talk about the way that her body became thinner and she became more attractive, more beautiful because she was a regular user of the vegetable compound, and it just had these sort of beneficial impacts on things that didn't have to do with psychological well-being or bodily health. It had to do with actual sort of beauty and the rest. And so it's this sort of belief that one's beauty is in part contingent on ensuring that physiological health and even psychic health are secured, and that only then can one actually become truly beautiful in various ways. So the meanings here are framed in the advertising. Again, the product is not changing. It's the type of advertising that changes to make the product have more meanings, potential meanings for users. You can see here a couple other examples of those types of promotional pamphlets that were sent out, health and beauty, right? So to be a beautiful person, you have to have good bodily health and in order for that to come about. Now, I want to focus here on a particular genre of advertising that Pinkham did heavily, and that is the testimonial ad. And these ads were commonplace in Pinkham advertising. They were you would see them in lots and lots of newspapers, lots and lots of other types of print media as well. And so here's a typical example of that. This is a woman. As you can see in the ad, her name is Mrs. Adolph Bratka, and it actually provides her address, 4316 South 13th Street, Omaha, South Omaha, Nebraska, right? It's a picture of her as well. There's a photograph of her in the ad. And in the ad, you can read it as well, but it basically just talks about her experience with the product. And as she said, she's no longer troubled by nervousness, again, the psychological claim, or pains in her left side, and pains in my left side. So it's a physical, bodily kind of point that's being made, but also the kind of psychological benefit that she claims to get from the product. And this is an example of a testimonial ad, but it's from an ordinary person, right? This is not a doctor or a scientist endorsing the product. It's not a celebrity that people might identify with or just be a fan of. This is just a regular person, a kind of a next door neighbor type person, maybe somebody you know in your family, etc., in terms of the way you would relate to her. And in that case, These types of ads using ordinary people and testimonial ads arguably kind of cement, they kind of have an authentic kind of dimension to them, right? They're designed as just a way for ordinary people to be offering kind of ordinary advice to the person next door. And in that sense, it's a kind of affirmation of the judgment, of the soundness of ordinary people, the kind of popular wisdom about ordinary people being the best sources of advice for information about health or whatever the case may be. The address sort of cements her authenticity, right? Because it's not just some generic ordinary person that you would see in an ad. This is an actual person. And you know she's an actual person because her address is there, her face is there in the photograph. And the fact that the address is there meant one more thing. It meant that people could actually write her with questions about their own physical problems or conditions or whatever, and seek out advice from her. And that's actually what happens with these ads, is that people actually write, in some cases, not to the Pinkham company, they do that too, but in other cases they'll write to Mrs. Adolf Bratka and sort of, hey, how, what was your experience with the product in terms of this? I have this condition, etc., etc. And the Adolf Bratkas of the Lydia Pinkham world would then forward that correspondence to the Lydia Pinkham company. And it became, well, we'll come to that later in terms of the way that this worked in more systemic terms and more kind of organizational terms in terms of how this type of market research was used by the company. But it's important to remember these types of testimonial ads involve ordinary people and not experts and not celebrities in that sense. And that's a hallmark feature of patent medicine advertising in general, but also some of the more recent patent medicine type products, the more contemporary ones that you'll be seeing in a second. They'll use ordinary people for the testimonial endorsements. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, I want to come up to the present now, and I want you to, there's a story here on the Q-Ray bracelet, and it's a marketplace story. I want you to click on that link. It's about 7 minutes, and you're going to see a kind of a journalistic expose of the Q-Ray bracelet. I want you to focus, though, on the way in which testimonials from users of the product are used to sell the product. Okay? So do that, and then come right back. Thanks. Okay, so assuming you're back. Now, what you saw there, of course, were a number of people that were talking about the way in which the product seemed to help them, right? And that's, again, it's a hallmark feature of this type of advertising for products, like health-related products that are on the margins of the sort of traditional medical kind of community, right? So the Q-Ray bracelet, just to give you some kind of background, as you saw in that clip there, the claim is that there was a kind of ionization process that existed in the metal that was used for these bracelets, and that this ionization process was delivering forms of pain relief or wellness or energy to the users of these bracelets. Now, the Q-Ray company, when it was selling these bracelets in the early 2000s, they were actually making claims that the bracelet could actually help you with arthritis. It could alleviate the pain of arthritis and other types of rheumatic illnesses like that, and even other types of autoimmune problems that people had. So they were making these claims. The federal government stepped in. There were some studies done of the bracelets, and lo and behold, they were found to be completely ineffective. And because of that, the government then effectively charged Q-Ray. There was a settlement in 2006, I believe, and Q-Ray had to pay $23 million to the federal U.S. government as a kind of fine for the false claims that they had been making before. And so what it means is that now Q-Ray in both the U.S. and Canada can't they're not able to say it can help you with arthritis or any kind of chronic pain issues. It has to talk in more general terms, at least officially. It has to talk about things like bioenergy. It has to talk in terms of vitality and feelings of well-being, and et cetera, et cetera. Again, that's very similar to patent medicines and even similar to what we saw with Lydia Pinkham before. Okay, here's another example. And this one in some ways is probably more compelling. So if you were, if you could just click on the first link there and you just read it. It's about a couple minutes to read this. And it's a testimonial from Amy Johnson. And it's a testimonial about her experience with the Gerson Institute. Now, to give you some backdrop here, so you'll see when you read this, and there's even a subsequent news article about this, that Amy Johnson is a seemingly ordinary woman. She's seems fairly bright. She has an engineering degree, had a business before. She's identified as living in St. Louis. So again, regular person, some kind of a identity that's linked to a city in this case. Well, she had ovarian cancer a few years ago. And the treatment initially was a hysterectomy. She seemed to have a kind of negative experience with the traditional medicine at that time. And so when the decision came, well, what do we do after the hysterectomy? And the advice from her medical doctors were that you should probably take some chemotherapy. She decided not to. And she did what she said was her own kind of investigation about alternative methods. And she came up with this place, so she learned about this place called the Gerson Institute. And what they do, and it's a place in Tijuana, Mexico. And they probably go there because then they're not subject to the types of health regulations that would exist in the U.S. Almost all of their actual clients are Americans who go to Tijuana for this. And it's an institute that claims that they have a kind of regimen, a treatment regimen, that they claim will help treat things like cancer and diabetes and lupus and actually other illnesses as well. And mostly it centers on intensive juicing. It's fruit and vegetable juicing, and literally people will be required to drink up to 15-20 pounds of this sort of juice a day. In addition to that, they do things like coffee enemas and other types of supplements. And it's a belief, and Gerson or Johnson mentions this as well. It's a belief that it helps the body, quote, heal itself. A kind of natural notion of what healing's all about. So she went and did this treatment, and then stayed cancer-free for a while after. And because of that, she assumed that she is cancer-free because of the Gerson treatment, right? And so in the course of recovering in the next couple of years, she basically decided to speak more on this and was giving talks about Gerson and even plans to write a book about this sort of thing. And you can see the second link there is a sort of news article about her story in that sense. Now, keep in mind here that there's no clinical evidence to show that this Gerson treatment is effective. None at all, right? I mean, the fact that she's cancer-free after having the hysterectomy could just well be that the treatment that she got, which was the hysterectomy to remove her ovaries, which was where the ovarian cancer was, to remove those, might have actually been the cure, right? And whether or not the cancer comes back, I mean, for some people, it never comes back, and for others, it can come back fairly soon, right? There's a lot of variability. And chemotherapy is generally a treatment you get to try and increase your odds against the cancer coming back. Okay, so in the event, what you want to think about with her is, again, if you read that, you really get the sense of how the testimonial works, right? This whole premise, this whole industry of alternative treatments for things like this are centered on the personal experiences of those who've done it, right? That's the evidence that counts for these people. Knowing somebody who did something, seeing a personal account of someone else, And that becomes the evidentiary litmus test for what is effective about this. So in this sense, it's a kind of story. It's a story of essentially stories over data, right? Anecdotes, stories, personal testimonies over data. And data would be in the form of clinical studies, scientific studies that would document whether a treatment is effective or not. In fact, if you were to click on this link here, you would see that it's actually a website where lots and lots of these types of personal anecdotes about alternative treatments for things like cancer exist, right? So here it's a belief system that is sustained by anecdote. It's sustained by testimonials, personal experience, and not at all logic and the rest. So if you were to take this and look at an example that's fairly prominent today in the media, and that's the issue about vaccines and those who are opposed to vaccines. Now, vaccines have been scientifically shown to be safe. The chances of an adverse outcome from taking a vaccine are tiny. They're almost infinitesimal. Okay? But nonetheless, there are people who believe that certain vaccines can cause adverse health effects. For example, some people claim that autism can result from certain types of childhood vaccines. There's no evidence to support that, but people will claim that because they knew somebody or they read of an account of somebody that had an adverse effect from taking a vaccine, maybe the child got sick, or maybe that child years later was diagnosed with autism, and they link that autism to an event, wrongly so, in terms of the vaccine. But it's all about stories, right? It's about people, stories, anecdotes. That's the driver of this. It's not because they're looking at evidence in a different way or reading scientific journals and coming up with a hypothesis that others had missed or something like that. It's about the stories that people share. So why this prevailing, we, in some level you could say we live in the greatest medical age ever, right? I mean, medical science today can do so much more for us in terms of prolonging our lives, in terms of treating all kinds of health conditions. Why is it that so many people still persist in believing that alternative methods are just as effective as those that are scientifically proven? And so you generally find there's a few kind of reoccurring factors in terms of what induces people to have these beliefs. And in one case, it's almost always that people have had certain kinds of unpleasant experiences with traditional medical doctors. They could have found a doctor that was uncaring or arrogant, etc. And it sort of they sort of conflated all of medicine or all of traditional medicine with their experience with that one doctor. So that tends to be a recurring theme. And in fact, with the example I had before from the Gerson Institute, Amy Johnson actually talks about that in her own testimonial. Others might believe that, science is sort of corrupt, governments are corrupt. Why would we trust industry or big government or something like that, right? And so they tend to want to do things that they can deal with personally, as opposed to having trust in large institutions like science. Others look specifically at pharma, big pharma, and say the pharma industry is basically only there to sell you stuff, to sell you drugs, and they'll basically do whatever they can to make you believe that a drug is the only way to get better. There's a bit of truth in that. There are many things that big pharma sells, many types of drugs they promote. Some say, for example, for dealing with depression, etc., that are really more about the marketing and advertising and getting people to believe that they have a particular condition. In some cases, if you have severe depression, you should take certain types of medication. I recognize that. But other studies have shown that for more episodic forms of depression or more low-level forms of depression, just merely exercising regularly and eating well can actually have a very positive effect on people in terms of their mental health, in terms of things like mild depression. Now, there's no money to be made in exercise and eating well, right? And so big pharma, of course, has less incentive to do that. Now, that's just one example. of pharma. But it doesn't mean that every pharmaceutical drug is really just there to rip you off. Okay, so we have to be careful about criticizing the entire industry in blanket terms. Another point to consider is that people have a kind of fear of toxins, just anything that's sort of chemical based, and what they really want are natural things, right? And so if you were to say to somebody, drinking juice from carrots that you grow in your backyard and that you put in a blender or a juicer, drinking that carrot juice is not only seen as healthy, but it's natural. And because it's natural, it's going to be seen as a preferred choice as opposed to taking some kind of chemical compound. And chemotherapy is often touted as being toxic in that sense, so it's very easily to dismiss by some as a cancer treatment. Okay. Now, in terms of natural, I mean, it's one thing to be talking about carrot juice. I don't know what's natural about a coffee enema in terms of what Amy Johnson was doing before. But again, I guess people's definitions of that may vary. The other factor here, of course, is the internet, right? Social media especially. So much information can circulate now. And so much information can circulate that has not been sort of given the stamp of approval by an expert or by an authoritative source, right? These stories, these anecdotes circulate just as fast as a clinical study on something. And in fact, you could argue that the anecdotes, those testimonials from individuals, are more readable. They're more persuasive for some people, right? Because they sort of come from another person, right? They describe things in the way that you can relate to perhaps more than, say, reading the results from a medical study. And as such, you get more misinformation and even forms of disinformation out there with respect to treating health problems. The other factor is the way that alternative medicine and even some patent medicines early on were doing this kind of promise of empowerment. The sense that it is very you focused, right? I mean, it's this idea that as a starting point, alternative medicine practitioners are often tout their ability to listen to people, right? The person comes in, they've often had a bad experience in conventional medicine. You listen to them, you affirm their importance, you affirm their identity, and you present the options to them as them taking control of their own health. And then for some people, they see this health regimen or this treatment regimen that's premised on forms of alternative medicine. Say in the case of Gerson, it was with the juices and rest, as really transformative or empowering. It's not even just that the health regimen they think actually cured them of a particular disease or helped them with that disease. They think of it as actually transforming their whole life, and it's broadly empowering to them. And if you look at the Amy Johnson piece from before, you'll see that she talks about it exactly that way. Her life has changed now because of the treatment regimen that she went into in that sense. Some have argued too that these sorts of approaches help people deal with real existential fears in their lives, like fears of dying young or fears of being alone for your life or something like that. And they do that because you develop these routines around the use, right? The regular juicing, the regular kind of taking of certain supplements or whatever, and that these things have become, they're kind of like talismans of hope and security. And the fact that you can regularly juice your carrots or something like that may actually help people deal with these larger fears in their lives. And the other thing to think about is that these kinds of health care approaches from alternative medicine often become linked up to a larger sort of belief system or a lifestyle. So if you look at that earlier material from Amy Johnson, you'll see that the way she describes the treatment regimen that she engaged in was very much sort of part of a larger sense of who she is and a lifestyle choice that she's making in that sense. We generally don't think when we go to the doctor that it's part of a kind of a lifestyle choice, right? It tends to be sort of a generic kind of visit the doctor, tell him or her what the issue is, maybe get prescription for it, or maybe get some other type of treatment. But we don't necessarily think of it as part of a kind of a lifestyle, and that it would be differentiated depending on what your lifestyle is. Now, I want to just look at one other aspect of this, and that's the issue of fake testimonials, right? So the Lydia Pinkham testimonials I had before are real. The example that I had from Amy Johnson, it's real. These people exist. They actually believe what they're saying. So I'm not saying that those testimonies are false or fake or whatever, because they may be touting something that is not clinically effective. But there were other cases where the actual testimonials that were found were actually faked. And I've just got one example of this here, and this is from the late 1800s as well, around 1900. And this is for a product called Duffy's whiskey. Now, Duffy's was a medicinal whiskey, so it was it wasn't just something you drank to have a good time or something like that. It was a medicinal whiskey that you were supposed to take in small doses every day, and it was promoted for treating conditions like consumption, but it was mainly promoted for longevity, for being able to live a long life if you were a regular user of Duffy's whiskey. And so one of the ways they thought would be good for marketing this product is if we could get a lot of old people to say that they were regular Duffy's users, and if we could get testimonials from old people, it would actually help document the claim that the product is actually good for longevity. So how do you get old people to endorse a product? Well, what they did, the company basically contracted out to these these smaller outfits that were in the business of securing testimonials for various products. And in this case, they went around to what would have been the equivalent of elderly homes or old age homes, mostly kind of like hospital type facilities where there were a lot of elderly people. And they went in there just trying to get people who would be willing to give an endorsement. Now, ideally, they wanted people who were over 100 years old to show that this was real longevity, right? Now, people that are over 100 years old might also have some kinds of cognitive impairment, right? They may not necessarily be fully understanding what's going on with them, and they may not fully understand what the conversation is that they're having with this particular person. And this was the case with this, with one example of this. So some of these testimonial hunters, they went to a facility where Nancy Teague lived, not this ad, but she was 106 years old, and they got a picture of her, and an ad was produced similar to what this one was. And it basically said, she endorsed the product, said she'd been drinking it for many, many years, and that she, quote, she didn't feel like I'm a day over 60, thanks to Duffy's. Now, she was 106, and so, great, they got the testimonial, the ads run. Well, the ads run, and then Nancy Teague's children notice it and go, "What are you doing, Mom? Like, you're a teetotaler. You don't drink whiskey. You're not even an alcohol consumer." And it became clear through the kind of controversy that particular example engendered was that Nancy Teague was not really fully aware that she was even giving a testimonial. And so that's an example of fake testimonials, right? You just kind of, in this case, you go to a lot of elderly home facilities and you basically just get people to give these endorsements, but they may not be fully aware if they're doing that. Or you just get a picture of them and you can put up some kind of fake claims as well. So that's a historical example of that from the patent medicine era. Here's the contemporary example of that. So what I'd like you to do is watch this video it's about 7 minutes, and it's the example of Sanpan. And you'll find it really interesting. So watch this, come back, and we're going to have the second half of the lecture then. All right? I'll see you soon.